So going off of that, now we're going to jump into our new series, because David, as you see on the front of your bulletin, he's identified in the Bible as a man after God's own heart. The thing I like about David is on the surface, everything seems really good and everything seems positive. David had a lot of mess-ups. I love the fact, and as we go through the next couple of weeks of studying David has a lot of mistakes, and it gives hope to me that when I make mistakes, when I make blunders, that God can still use me and that God still loves me. That no failure, no mistake that I ever make, it's too much that God will be unable to continue to use me. As we walk through our series on Who is Your Shiro, we're talking about women in the Bible who had big influences. A couple of them set up today because we see that individuals who were in the bloodline who helped get David to where he was born. Last week we looked at Hannah, who was the mother of Samuel, that she gave Samuel back to God, and she was unable to have children, but said, you know, God, if you will let me have a child, I will name him Samuel, I will give him back, and he'll be for your purposes. And Samuel plays a big role in David's story of really identifying him. So this morning, I just want to jump into our first text. This is our main text of the morning, and it's 1 Samuel 16, 1 through 13. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you be filled with sorrow because of Saul? I refuse to have him as king over Israel. Fill your animal horn with olive oil and go on your way. I am sending you to Jesse in Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." But Samuel said, "How can I go? Suppose Saul hears about it, then he'll kill me." The Lord said, "Take a young cow with you. Tell the elders of Bethlehem, I've come to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, then I will show you what to do. You must anoint for me the one I point out to you." Samuel did whatever the Lord said. He arrived at Bethlehem. The elders of the town met him. They were trembling with fear. They asked, "Have you come in peace?" Samuel replied, "Yes, I've come in peace. I've come to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. Set yourself apart to him and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he set Jesse and his sons apart to the Lord. He invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab. He thought, "This has to be the one the Lord wants me to anoint for him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider how handsome or tall he is. I have not chosen him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outside of a person, but the Lord looks at what is in the heart." Then Jesse called Jesse had Shammah walk by, but Samuel said, "The Lord hasn't chosen him either." Jesse had 7 of his sons walk in front of Samuel, but Samuel said to him, "The Lord hasn't chosen any of them." So he asked Jesse, "Are these the only sons you have?" "No," Jesse answered, "my youngest son is taking care of the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We won't sit down to eat until he arrives." So Jesse sent for his son and had him brought in. He looked very healthy. He had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Get up and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel got the animal horn that was filled with olive oil. He anointed David in front of his brothers. From that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on David. Samuel went back to Ramah. The thing that I think is interesting here, and we're going to look at the front part of the text and the back part of the text. But you have Samuel, who as the prophet, and would be considered the last of the judges, between him and Eli. They're the last 2 judges before the period of the kings start. And Samuel identifies the fact that all of a sudden, Saul's not supposed to be king. And we're going to go there in a second, but God tells him, you need to go and anoint the new king. Imagine that in today's day and age, we operate in America with the system of a president, that if you were to go and walk through all the systems, like any of us in the room, I don't know if any of us have the legitimate power to do what I'm about to suggest, but to go and say, you know what, I want to remove a sitting president from power. And there's a process in which you have to do that. Samuel is the one person who God is calling to anoint the new king, to remove King Saul from power. And he's worried and he's fearful for his life. In order to really see why, though, we need to jump back 1 chapter, because I want you to understand really what's happening here. 1 Samuel 15, 10 through 23 says, Then the Lord gave Samuel a message. He said, I am very sad I have made Saul king. He has turned away from me. He has not done what I directed him to do. When Samuel heard that, he was angry. He cried out to the Lord during that whole night. Early the next morning, Samuel got up. He went to see Saul, but Samuel was told, Saul went to Carmel. There he set up a monument in his own honor. Now he has gone down to Gilgal. When Samuel got there, Saul said, May the Lord bless you. I've done what he directed me to do. But Samuel said, Then why do I hear the bawling of sheep? Why do I hear the mooing of cattle? Saul answered, The soldiers brought them back from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle. They did it to sacrifice them to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed everything else. That's enough, Samuel said to Saul. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. That's like a scary phrase right there. Like, the prophet cuts you off and says, Let me tell you what God said. Tell me, Saul replied. Samuel said, There was a time when you didn't think you were important, but you became the leader of the tribes of Israel. And just taking a pause there, that to me is just, it's such a powerful beginning of the statement. There was a time where you didn't think you were important, and then you became the leader of the tribes of Israel. There's an identifier that you didn't think you were good enough to do this job, but then God made you and gave you the ability to do this very job that you didn't feel you were qualified for. He sent you to do something for him. He said, Go and completely destroy the Amalekites. Go and destroy those evil people. Fight against them until you have wiped them out. Why didn't you obey the Lord? Why did you keep for yourselves what you had taken from your enemies? Why did you do what is evil in the sight of the Lord? But I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went to do what he sent me to do. I completely destroyed the Amalekites. I brought back Agag and their king. The soldier took sheep and cattle from what had been taken from our enemies. They took the best of what had been set apart to God. They wanted to sacrifice them to the Lord, your God, at Gilgal. But Samuel replied, What pleases the Lord more, burnt offerings and sacrifices or obeying the Lord? Is it better to obey them than to offer a sacrifice? Is it better to do what he says than to offer the fat of rams? Refusing to obey the Lord is as sinful as using evil magic. Being proud is as evil as worshiping statues of gods. You refuse to do what the Lord has told you to do, so he has refused to have you as king. In that very moment, God uses Samuel to revoke kingship and leadership over his people because he simply wouldn't obey what God had called him to do. That statement just jumps out at me. Refusing to obey the Lord is as sinful as using evil magic. And that being proud is as evil as worshiping statues of gods. It's so easy for us to look and point at other people and say, well, at least I'm not doing that. I mean, ultimately, I would be willing to bet in the last month that all of us have had that type of a thought of, I'm not perfect, but at least I'm not them. At least I'm not practicing evil magic. Did you obey God in every single thing you were supposed to do in this past month? Every time God has told you, go and talk to this person. Every moment where God has called you to witness. Every moment where God has called you to give. Every moment where God has called you to tell the truth. Have we done it? If we haven't, then we are on the same equivalency of those who are practicing evil magic. That if we are acting as proud, we're as evil as those who are worshiping statues of gods, we're all stuck in sin. There's not one of us that's great. There's not one of us that has it all together. The quicker we come to realize that we don't have it together, the quicker we can identify our weakness, and in our weakness, God is made strong. Because when we operate hiding our weaknesses, then all of a sudden we kind of hide these deficiencies, we hide these things that people can't see, and then all of a sudden we'll ultimately fall to that weakness. There is something, just a thought process in society that would simply say, if you have a weakness, like, make your weakness your strength. Well, ultimately, we're not going to necessarily always make our weakness our strength. It's not an excuse to not work on our weakness. But when we can identify our weakness, we can surround ourselves with people who their weakness is actually, our weakness is their strength. As we identify those people that's their strength, that then builds us up. For example, we are called to be the body of Christ, and the body has many parts. That if I realize that my job in the body of Christ is to be a hand, as much as I want to try, A hand is not a kidney. And you can look at it and say, well, the hand can do many great things. The hand can pick things up. Here's the thing that we get confused about, though. If the kidney's not working properly, the body can die. If the lung isn't breathing, the body can die. If the feet aren't moving, it doesn't matter that the hand can grasp and the hand can pick up things. If my hand can't get to the other side of the stage because my feet aren't working, my hand is useless. And even then, even if I go to pick up this piece of paper, my hand can grasp it, but my bicep and my tricep, everything in my arm has to pick it up. Everything has to work together. Everything works together. And when we're prideful, we miss out on that. And this is where King Saul gets. It's about him now. That in the beginning, he was humble. In the beginning, he didn't see issues. In the beginning, he was following after God. And I think such a key phrase that gets said here is that he brought these animals back, and his soldiers brought these animals back, so that he can do a sacrifice to the Lord your God. He doesn't say the Lord my God. He doesn't say the Lord our God. He says the Lord your God. He's reaching a point where he doesn't need the sacrifice for himself. He's just providing the sacrifice for God's people over here. But ultimately, he needs it just as much. And so in this moment, there's this identifying process that God is looking at and says, he's not the king. He's not the leader of my people anymore. Samuel, it's time to find someone else. And Samuel's worried about it, but Saul might kill me. It's amazing how even as the prophet, Samuel still has doubts. He still has worries of what's going to happen to me. And what I think is interesting is when this whole parade of people come in front of Samuel, is it this son, is it this son? You just get done realizing that you have Saul here who's operating now in pride and operating in everything that he's not supposed to. And the very first thing that Samuel does is he looks at the oldest, most handsome son and says, that must be him. That must be the one. But God says, it's not the one you're thinking, which that brings me to my first point for this morning, that God's call is not always conventional. When we think about it, it's so often through Scripture, God calls the second son, or God calls the individual who doesn't feel like they have life put together. You have all of these sons that get put on a parade in front of Samuel. Which one is it going to be? Which one is going to be king? To me, this plays out like the story of Cinderella. I mean, except that we don't have a prince and a princess and a glass slipper, but we have 8 sons, and Jesse and 7 of his sons get invited to come to the party. See, I've always read this passage of Scripture as one thing, and when I reread it this week, something jumped out at me. Samuel invites them to go to a sacrifice. I always read it that Samuel went to their house, and that Samuel went there, and David, he was still off in the fields. He just hadn't come in yet. But he invites them to come to a sacrifice, and Jesse brings his 7 oldest sons, but he leaves David behind. He leaves, like, there's no way, David. He's not going to pick David for this. We're just going to leave him here. I'm going to take these 7, and David, he can stay in the field. He's not going to be the one that gets picked. And you have this parade of son after son, of the oldest, maybe the smartest, maybe the most handsome, maybe the tallest, the ones that look like they could be the best leaders. But none of those individuals are the ones that get picked. Here's the thing that we need to realize today, that if we want to be individuals after God's own heart, we have to realize that God is going to pick who he wants to pick to do what he wants to do. There's moments in probably all of our lives where we look at somebody that they got the promotion, they got the opportunity, they got the very thing that I want. But God, why didn't I get that? Why didn't I have that chance? God's going to put the people in especially in leadership within the church, he's going to put the people where he wants them to see the most people come to a saving knowledge of who Jesus Christ is. And sometimes that means that you may not be the one who gets picked to do something. You may be a part of that parade of 7 people who one after another walks in front of the prophet, and you don't get picked. But then all of a sudden, here's the youngest out in the field. When we look at what a lot of the theologians think, they peg David at this period of time being somewhere between the ages of 10 and 15. Right now, a decent amount of our 10 through 15-year-olds in this building are down the hall. They're not in this room. We're educating them. We're teaching them about the Bible on a level that they can understand, but they're not in this room right now. And you think of that, it's like, David, maybe someday he could do something great, but we're going to send him down. He's going to be out in the field taking care of the sheep. And we even see, leading into what we're going to talk about next week, the fact that David at this age is fighting like lions and bears to protect these sheep. He's good at what he does, but he's not king worthy. That's not who we're going to pick, but God knows that this is who he wants because he's coming from a spot of Saul, who has become prideful, who has become all about him. He wants to throw away anything in that matter because he wants to say, this is my chosen individual. I want someone whose heart is pure, that someone who's going to follow me, that even if they make mistakes, that they're going to love me and they're going to care about the things that I care about. I don't care about the most handsome. I don't care about the smartest, because when we're using God as our source, any degree of wisdom that we need is going to come from him anyways. That some of the best leaders in the world aren't necessarily the best looking people in the world. But at the same time, we're all created in the image of God. So don't allow anything to say, you know what, God has called me to this, but I don't feel like I'm good enough. If God's called you to it, he's going to equip you to do it in his power. And trust him. It may not look conventional. It may not be the way you want to do it, but it's going to work. Let me just give you an example. I'm going to give you two choices. If you already know the answer to this, don't shout out the answer. But you can either right now today, I could give you $1 million, or I'll give you a penny today, and every day for 30 days, I'll double that penny. Who would take the first option of the $1 million? I see a few hands. How many of you would take the penny doubled? How many of you have no clue? That's okay. $1 million is nothing to laugh at. I mean, $1 million would be nice. I think any one of us in here, if instead of I think there would be like a rush to get out to get that check after service. $1 million is something nice, but if we use the example of a penny doubled every single day for 30 days, at the end of those 30 days, it is $5,368,709.12. Because one penny turns into 2, which turns into 4, which turns into 8, and continues on until day 30 where it hits that mark. Sometimes the unconventional choice, the thing that doesn't necessarily sound great or doesn't look like it makes sense, in the grand scheme, when you play it out on the bigger level, is exactly the right thing, and you just can't see it yet. David was the unconventional choice, but he was the right choice because he was following after God's heart. The second point I want to make this morning is that the fulfillment of the call may not come when we expect it, but it is never late. So often we have this attitude with God of, God, this is what I want to do. You called me to this. You called me at camp when I was in 11th grade to go and do this, but you've never provided the opportunity for me to go yet. God, what's wrong? Why isn't this happening yet? Because we view things on our timetable and not God's timetable. God may very well have had to call you at a spot where you were willing to hear his voice and you're able to hear his voice, but you haven't had the opportunity to execute that call yet. And maybe for you it's a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 30 years ago. But at the appropriate time, God will fulfill the very things that he has called and he has placed on your heart. If we're looking at David, for example, a couple minutes ago I said that he was between the ages of 10 and 15 in this moment. We look at his entire life, if we play it out, he dies at the age of 70. We know that he rules over Judah for 7.5 years, and then all of Israel for 33 years. So he rules for 40 years as king. Doesn't take a lot of work to do a quick equation of 70 minus 40 is 30. He became king at 30, even though his call came somewhere between 10 and 15. He had to wait between 15 and 20 years for that moment when Samuel comes before him and anoints him and says, you are the next king of Israel. It takes 15 to 20 years for that to come to fruition. I would imagine back then that would be difficult, as saying, you have to wait 15 to 20 years before the very thing that God has spoken over you, the very thing that he told you that he was going to do, the promises are going to come to pass. You have to wait 15 to 20 years until you see it happen. That would have been hard then, but it's even harder today in our culture. It's hard for us to wait 15 to 20 minutes, let alone 15 to 20 days, let alone 15 to 20 years. Are we willing to say, God, I will sit in the field and I will take care of the sheep until you say it's time. And when you say it's time, then I'll jump into action. Then I'll do the things that you've called me to do. You see, we look at so often the fact that I got to sit out in the field, and God, you're not doing what you said that you were going to do. And now I'm starting to doubt, God, if I was even called in the first place. And just simply by saying, God, what are you trying to do? Why is this not happening? Why isn't this happening in my way, in my timing, in my place, in the way I want it? And notice as I make those statements, it's I. It's never about us. The moment it becomes about us, we become Saul. It's not about Saul. God removes Saul from the equation. God removes Saul so he can put in David and somebody who would follow after God's own heart. You can only be chasing after God's heart or your heart. And if you chase after your heart, you're going to find things that are failures over and over again. You're not going to be happy. I mean, all it takes is to look at the last couple of weeks of some of the suicides that have happened from millionaires. That money wasn't enough for them. I don't know what their mental states were when Kate Spade or Anthony Bourdain did what they did, but all the wealth didn't make anything better. I think for a lot of us, we can sometimes say, I have a lot of good things going on, but if I just had a little bit more money, then things would be better. Not in their case. The only thing that will make things better is having a saving knowledge of who Christ is and basing our identity in who he is and what he wants us to do. And if he wants you to sit in a field and wait for 15 to 20 years, then I'm going to sit in the field and wait for 15 to 20 years because I'm going to trust that in his timing, his plan will be better than anything that I can imagine. Because it's Father's Day, I think it's an appropriate day to use a sports analogy here. So if you don't like sports, it's only going to be for a moment. But the Philadelphia 76ers, for some of you that you're big into the NBA, that you'll know what I'm about to say, but they coined a phrase a couple years ago called trust the process. And the idea behind trust the process, the general manager, Sam Hinnicky, his idea was, our team is messed up, we had bad contracts, I'm going to get rid of every good player that we have. We are going to tank. We are going to be the worst team in the NBA. And he gets hired as the general manager, and he is essentially saying this on day one. On the very first NBA draft they had, he traded away his best player. He essentially made the team completely unwatchable. For example, in the 2013, 14, and 15 NBA seasons, their record was a combined 47 wins and 246 losses. A good NBA team, like a mediocre NBA team, has 47 wins in 1 year, let alone in 3 years. And in 2015 alone, they went 10-72. Who wants to watch that? And he, all along the way, is saying, trust the process. Trust the process. He ends up getting himself fired. Because the idea sounds good, but when you're looking at a 47 and, I just lost it, 47 wins and 240 some losses, that's not a good record. But what happens is when you're the worst team in the NBA for long enough, you get one of the top 4 picks. They do a lottery. Typically, you get into that first, second, or third pick. The worst thing that the 76ers could have is the 4th pick. For 3 years, they continue to get really good picks. They get the picks right. They pick the right players. Then in 2016, the year after going 10-72, they went a crazy record of 28-54. Still bad, but 18 wins, that's improvement. But this past season, they went 52-30. They're now viewed as a potential landing spot for LeBron James, the best player today. And if they get LeBron James, they will be the favorites to win the NBA championship next year. They had to go through 4 horrific seasons of basketball. But now, if you go to one of their games, they chant, "Trust the process." That in the playoffs, when they were playing Boston, the fans traveled from Philadelphia to Boston and began a cheer of "Trust the process" as they were beating Boston by about 20 points in one particular game. Because they realize now that what Sam started was something that is now turning them into the most promising up-and-coming team that is going to be a team to be reckoned with for years, with 2 legitimate all-stars on that team right now. I wonder sometimes if God is working a process in our life where we feel my life is falling apart, my life isn't any good, and God is just simply trying to chip away everything in our life that's not of Him, that's not going to bring Him glory, that's not going to bring Him praise, and He's trying to throw all of that away. And it may take a year or 2 for you to truly put your life back together. But when that moment comes where everything comes back together, everything fits together, then all of a sudden, we're going to be viewed as that young up-and-coming individual. We're going to be viewed as that wise scholar. We're going to be viewed as that person. They're someone after God's own heart. They've got it all together. You see, a lot of times when we look at people, they've got it all together. They love God. Their family is great. It's because they've had to go through a process. And sometimes the process was a little bit easier for some people because they lucked their way into something. Sometimes the process is a little bit more difficult because the road was harder to get there, but at the end of the day, we have to trust the process. We have to trust our general manager. We have to trust that God is in control. He is making all the right calls, and if we follow Him and we do what He tells us to do, we use the Holy Spirit as our coach, and we go and say and believe the things that the coach is telling us to do, that all of a sudden everything is going to come together. Everything is going to fit, and in His timing, not ours. Do what He says when He says to do it. Not when you say to do it. Because when you say to do it, you can jump the gun and you can miss out. We can say, you know what, God, I know You've called me to do this. I know You want me to do something great. So I'm going to jump in and be involved in 37 different ministries in the church because I want to make the church great again. I want to make the church strong. And all of a sudden we get so focused on I again because we're not willing to wait for God's timing, and the focus becomes I want. And when we focus on I, we become Saul, and Saul gets kicked out of the kingship. The last point I want to hit on today is the title of this message today, that we need to revel in the idea of being chosen. That the idea of revel is to take great pleasure. That we need to realize that God has called us. God has called me to something different than He has called you to do. And it's not your job to say, oh, I really wish I could be the pastor of this church. Well, this season right now, God has called me into that role. And there could be a day coming where He calls somebody else into this role. And He may call you into doing something new that you've never done before. But whatever God has called you into, that we need to take pleasure in the calling that God has placed on our life. If you want to follow after God's own heart, you want to get everything and do things the way God wants you to do, we need to take pleasure in where He has you right now. If God has you in the middle of the field, you need to take pleasure in it right now because He is preparing you for greatness. Next week when we talk about David in the battle with Goliath, if David hadn't spent his time in the field protecting the sheep, he wouldn't have been able to take out Goliath. I'm jumping ahead of myself next week, but think about that. If he didn't take pleasure in where he was, there's multiple Psalms that would have never been written. That means something to us today. So in order to revel in being chosen, to take pleasure in it, here's what happens. It gives us an assurance during our struggle. When we know that God has called us, when we're struggling with things, we can take assurance that God is still there. That if God has started a great work, He's not going to leave us in the middle of that. That we can take assurance knowing that, hey, I may have a struggle right now, but God's right there. That I'm willing to bet any of you in this room that have been a Christian for any length of time, you've had a period, whether it was a day, whether it was a week, a year, where you sat back and said, I keep messing up. Am I really a Christian? Does God really love me? Do I really love God? Am I just faking this whole church thing? And we struggle with it because we don't have everything together. When we know that God has chosen us, that we know that God has called us to something, David can sit out in the field and say, like, I'm not doing what God has called me to do yet. And we can have the assurance of knowing I may not be doing yet what he's called me to do, but I know he's called me, and I know it's coming, and I'm going to be ready in that moment. I'm going to be prepared for it. If we can shift our attention and say, yes, I can struggle, but again, when I struggle, my weakness is identified. When my weakness is identified, I can turn it over to God. It's the quicker you get rid of your weakness and you hand it to God, the quicker God can become your strength in that weakness. The second one is this, is that we have strength after failure. When we know that God's called us, we have two choices when we fail. We can either run away from God or we can run to God. Those are your two choices. When we can look at Saul, and he knows that he did it wrong. We know that he messed up. And then all of a sudden he starts throwing accusations back in Samuel's direction. Here's the thing with him, though. He chose to say, yeah, I messed up, deal with it. Where for us, we need to look at it and say, you know what, I messed up. God, you're my strength. You're my source of everything. I can't do it on my own. It doesn't matter if we're victorious. I think a lot of people, it's, well, yeah, but the result was right. Who cares about the result if the process was wrong? You can force your way into a lot of things, but if it's not God's will, it's not going to work God's way. We have to trust the process that God has us on, and that even when we fail, that we can move forward. That when we look at our failures as setups for a comeback, because God looks at you and says, yeah, you fell down, let me pick you back up again, let me point you in the right direction, and let me move you in the direction that I want you to go. Our failures can be some of the greatest things that push us in the direction that God intends for us to go in. And then the last one is simply this, is that when we revel in the calling, that we have hope in our trials. That when trials are happening, you know there's a reason that this is happening. There is a great peace that can come when we know that God's in control and that God has called us and that God is moving us in a direction. Let me share what is now a funny story that last Friday was a horrifying story that was happening. So over the weekend we had Matt and Claire. They came over to our house. We've been great friends with them for so long that they stayed in our guest room. We moved Lydia in with Quinn, and their 3 kids slept in Lydia's room in an air mattress. And we were sitting down, talking and catching up on Friday night. I think they came in somewhere about 10:30, and we're sitting there talking for about 2 hours. We've got snacks. We're having a great old time. And it's 12:30, and all of a sudden Claire walks by the stairs going downstairs and says, sounds like there's a leak downstairs. How many of you like that? That's not a comforting, like, what's going on? And so instantly I go down and I'm walking down the stairs and I start hearing dripping. I'm thinking, well, maybe it's a pipe that's dripping. I don't know. No, I get in the basement and probably from like every surface in the middle of the room, water is pouring into our basement. And it's dripping from wood, it's dripping from the air conditioner vents, it's dripping from pipes, and we're like, what's going on? Like in this moment, I'm thinking it's 12:30, that I need to call a plumber. This is going to cost a lot of money. We've got guests over here. Am I going to get any sleep tonight? And so Matt and I, we go downstairs in the basement, and we're trying to figure out where it is. And Annie and Claire, they're trying to mop up water, but the drains are completely filled. So we're like, is it coming up from the floor? I basically felt like our basement was the annex for a couple minutes. Except, all of a sudden, I looked, this is the one spot that seems like the most water is coming from. And it was coming from like a little copper pipe coming out of the wood floor. It wasn't coming from anything that looked like it made sense. So I went upstairs, like, well, there's 2 sources of water directly above me. It's the kitchen sink, and it's the refrigerator, because we can get water and ice from there. I look at the freezer door, and it was sticking out a little bit. And I open it up, and I pull out the top where the ice tray is. And our ice tray is completely filled with water. And I pulled the fridge out, and there's water all over the floor. The ice maker just started running water, and it was pouring and going down. And so in the process of trying to take this ice tray out, a lot of it spilled, and then I can hear Matt now in the basement like, it's getting worse. It's getting so much worse. And in that moment, I felt a peace. Matt didn't feel the peace because he had water pouring on him. I had a peace because I know what it is. And as soon as that became the situation, I knew, okay, because earlier in the evening, it all started kind of connecting in my mind, that the arm for the ice maker had come off. I had put it back on. I thought I had it on well enough. I didn't have it on well enough. And when the freezer was left open a little bit, that whole combination of events allowed us to have water in our basement. So we got the arm put back on right, we got all the water cleaned up, and there hasn't been a problem since. But it was funny because in my preacher mind, as soon as that was happening, I was thinking, I wonder how I can use this in a sermon illustration. Because I look at it and say, even when things go bad in my life, there's hope because God's in control. And it's amazing how there is a peace. Like in the moment where I realized, here's the problem. It wasn't some crazy plumbing issue that was hidden in the walls. There's an issue with this, and in the worst case scenario, all I have to do is unplug my refrigerator. We may, in that worst case scenario, we may lose some food, but it's not a big issue on the grand scale in the house. And so often we look at problems that happen and we say, oh, there's no hope. As long as we're serving the God of the universe, who created the universe, who created you, there's always hope. And so often if we allow God to say, oh, this is what I want to do, I'm going to do something unconventional, I'm going to do it in my timing, and just sit back and enjoy the ride. That's difficult. It's difficult to sit back and enjoy the ride. But that's what we need to do. We need to sit back and enjoy the ride. And today, as we, again, just talk about it being Father's Day, to the dads in the room, it's your call to be the structure that roots your family in the things of Christ. That if you want to have children who follow after God's own heart, you have to be the dad who's following after God's own heart first. Because your kids are looking at you. For the kids in this church that maybe they're in a spot where they don't have that role in their life, then we need to be men of this church who model Christ for every child in this building, for every teenager in this building, for every young adult in this building, for the people that didn't have a great relationship with their dad. We need to be men in this church that rise up and say, God matters, church matters, a relationship with Jesus Christ matters, and here's why. And watch me as I follow after Christ. It may not happen the way you want it to. It may not happen in the time that you want it to. Trust the process, and it's a fun journey. This morning, if the worship team could just come up. I have to believe that there's some of you in the room today that you're struggling with this concept. You're struggling with the fact of knowing what your real identity is, that you're stuck out there in the middle of the field and you're wondering, did I get forgotten? Is God ever going to follow through on what he's promised for me? And I want you to know that yes, he has not forgotten you. He has not forsaken you. He will not revoke the calling that he has given to you. That if God has placed a call on you and you're still breathing, the opportunity still exists to execute that call. Maybe you're like David and you've been stuck out in the fields for 15, 20 years waiting for the moment. You had this amazing moment. It could have been at an altar in a church. It could have been at a camp as a teenager. I don't know when it would happen for you, but you're sitting back and you're wondering, why isn't this happening yet? And God's saying, because it's not the right time. And when it is the right time, you will understand why you had to wait. But I've got the perfect place for you. I've got the perfect scenario for you. I've got the perfect job for you. I have the right person to share the gospel with that person. Just trust the process. Trust me because I know so much more. I know so much better. And this morning, if that's you and you're sitting back and you're struggling with what David had to walk through, David was the Cinderella that didn't get invited to the ball. But Samuel said, I'm hearing from God, these ones aren't it. Where's the other son? We are going to sit and we are going to wait, and we will not partake of this food until David gets here. And it's the same thing for us. When God has a call on your life, He's not forgotten you. You just have to be patient and wait for God's call, not your call. Your I must die so that God can thrive. The quicker you allow your I to die, the quicker we get rid of Saul, and the quicker we step into being someone like David who's following after God's heart. So this morning, as the worship team just leads us in worship right now, I would just challenge you that if you struggle with this at all, just come to the altars. Don't worry about anybody else in the room. Because if you're worried about other people in the room, you're operating in a prideful mindset. And as we're talking about, pride is equal to worshiping statues. There's only one that's worth worshiping this morning. That's God. So let's just stand up. Let's worship. This altar space is available and open. Let's just put God first this morning.